I think it's safe to say that having a good core loop for your game is one of the most important things. No hot takes so far yet. But I think what a lot of developers, and especially developers who are in their first few games, kind of fail to realize is that having a good or even great gameplay loop honestly is just a tiny part of making a good game. We've made a lot of mistakes in our own past as well, and I think one thing that we are getting better at now is delivering overall good experiences. Because yeah, our first games we had good gameplay loop ideas, but the delivery was just so bad that it didn't matter how good or bad the core gameplay loop was. There were so many other offensive parts of our games that people didn't even want to care about the gameplay loop anymore. And this is something that I see a lot with our audience as well, so that's what I want to talk about in this video. These are 5 different components of a game, I would say, that make your game go from, oh, this is just another hobbyist project slop on Steam, to, hey, this is actually a pretty polished and nice experience. Because we say oh, this is a polished game so often, but how do you actually get to that polished state? And how do you make it seem like your game, is actual high quality? And I think we have to be honest, we're gonna go in with our biggest mistake, most of the time your guys' biggest mistake as well, and that is inconsistent art styles. I don't care that you're a bad artist. We're bad artists ourselves. But one thing that we've learned to realize is that it doesn't matter how good or bad you are as an artist. You can do a lot with lighting and post-processing or whatever, but the one offense that you cannot get around is by mixing art styles in your game. I get a lot of games submitted from you guys, and then I get these Steam pages and it's yeah, I'm not really getting the wish lists. Why is that? And the answer is just because the game looks like a 4-year-old made it by just literally throwing everything together in the engine, and that's it. So they have, for example, a high poly PBR, super realistic looking level, but then they throw in Cinti low poly characters or super stylized characters. And then this one I'm annoyed by even more. Their UI, you'll talk about UI standalone later as well, but it's stuff oh, it's a pixel art UI, and then they have AI generated, once again, that weird kind of realistic, but not really, kind of very off-putting AI art for icons or characters or whatever. And I look at that and it's nobody wants to play this. Nobody. I can guarantee you that. Getting a consistent art style just shows that your game has a vision. Because if you're just throwing in everything under the sink, and there are games where you maybe think that, for example, what we did with Unicycle Pizza Time, we threw in 50 different assets. But we made sure that all of them were still PBR based, high poly PBR. We didn't put anything stylized in there. We made sure that all of the assets fit together. And even though, on a technical level, the art style isn't amazing, wow, super good post-processing, whatever, the game looks consistent. And this is a super important thing. I guess it kind of does tie into marketing, because if someone looks at your game and it looks like a Forge Industry, or it looks like someone just threw this together in Unity and had no idea about what they actually wanted to go with an art style, nobody's going to really want to even try out the game, because it just screams, I am a garbage game and I am slop. Honestly, my main piece of advice here is that even if you have no single visual inspired bone in your body, go with Cinti assets. I know a lot of people get flack for using Cinti assets because it's oh, this is what everyone uses. The thing is, at least they allow you to have consistent games. And I think that is so important. I want to keep hammering on it. It's better to have a consistent, but maybe somewhat generic art style, but you can still elevate it through things like lighting, post-processing and all of that, than to just have a game that looks like it was thrown together. And speaking of, things that are thrown together, that brings me to the second point, and this is one that I see a lot with our audience as well, like most of these at the end of the day, and that is just having giant empty spaces. I think this is something, and I've talked about it in another video over there, of hey, how long should my game be? How much content should my game have? A lot of developers are okay, I'm going to make my open world indie RPG, whatever, with 50 hours of content, whatever. And it's very easy to get started. You just open up a big scene, you draw some mountains on there, and then you place down a town here, and you place down a town there, and then you play the game, and you realize that there is nothing to do for 10 minutes whilst you walk from town 1 to town 2, and it's yeah, nobody cares about this. This is bad, don't do that. Another example that I see often is okay, there are games and they bought an asset, for example, for a fantasy town, I'll say, and then they just import the demo scene and they add 3 characters, 3 interactables, and that's the game. I know, these sound like dumb ideas, but trust me, I have seen games on Steam released with all of these things in it basically. And then yeah, of course you're going to get negative reviews about like, hey, there is no content in this game, because you're not giving your player anything to do, but you're chasing that dream of open world 50 hours of content or however many. And because of that, the quality of your games just suffers so much. I've done a lot of level design at this point, and whilst I'm not a pro, I definitely started to realize that, hey, actually, you should make your levels way smaller than you think they are, because even just in Overtime Anomaly, walking from one side of the level to the other, which takes, I would say, 20 seconds, is kind of boring already. Even though you have that fear of, hey, something may happen, and there are some interactables. Don't let your player just walk around emptiness. I think one rule of thumb that I also try to keep in mind, and that I've heard other developers talk about, is always give the player something to do when they're traversing the level about every 15 to 30 seconds, basically. Whether that is something like, in Breath of the Wild, you find the Korok seeds, or there's a little side quest or anything. You just want to make sure that the world is meaningful, and if you don't have anything meaningful, then you need to shrink it so that it does make more sense. And then we get to the part that we also, we're still not great at it, but this is something that if you can do this well for your game, it is one of those things that people will maybe not notice immediately, but it is so important, and it is having consistent UI. Any game you make, realistically, is going to need to have some UI, even if it's just the main menu. And your UI is basically the thing that the player is going to look at the most as well, apart from maybe your main character. Yet a lot of developers, they just throw in some default Unity text with the ugly stroke and the ugly font and all of that, and just call it a day. And I think, yeah, it's technically functional, but it's just like, you can do so much more in kind of a pretty low amount of time. Like, there's definitely an 80-20 rule for UI, but a lot of you guys don't even do that 20% that gets you 80% of the results. And I want to talk about that. Some things, like I said, is having inconsistent styles for your UI, your borders and whatever. This is what happens when you don't, for example, correctly slice your UI and things like that, and you just stretch it out and then it looks ugly and all of that. I think something else that I see a lot, and we've made this mistake, please don't do it yourself for the love of God, is like having auto font sizing, so that you can just have your text box, and then whether you have a very long board or a pretty short board, it's going to automatically expand. This looks horrible. Once again, there is no visual consistency as well. You want to make sure that everything is the same font size and all of those things. This is stuff that I know sounds pretty specific. I think one thing that I can recommend you is when you get started for your game, choose like 2 or 3 fonts, and those are all the fonts you're going to need for your game. I think fonts can be a really easy win to make your game feel more bespoke, feel like you actually put thought and care into it. If you want to know more, fonts, they sound like a bit of a boring topic, but in the Game Clinic, he made a video about it that I think is really good, talking about, hey, the different styles of fonts and how do you use fonts in your games. Maybe one more thing for this UI part, because I can keep giving examples, but I do want to talk about this one as well, is like making the UI make sense. And I don't mean just from a navigation perspective, but also simple dumb things like if you have pop-up windows, you can click outside of the window and it will automatically close, or you can press escape and the window that's currently open will already close. These things aren't done default for you most of the time, and you don't want to always have the user drag their cursor to the close button when they can do it with like hotkeys or other ways that are just more intuitive and more in line with what people may expect from other professional software or websites or whatever. And then we get to the part that a lot of people talk about, like, oh yeah, just add polish to your game. But how do you actually do that? Those are things like, for example, having a weighty game, like, your impacts and all of that, having good game feel and having that polish. I think one of the best examples I can give to just visualize this is, okay, you're playing a first-person game, let's say, and you want to pick up an item from the ground. So you go and you look at it and you press the interact button and it instantly snaps into your hand. You did no pickup animation, you have nothing at all. It just poof appears. That doesn't feel good, even especially if it's things like it's silent, there's not even like a grab sound effect. Those are all like small micro interactions, I would almost say, that add up to that thing called polish. You can't just do one thing and your game is suddenly polished. You have to do everything better. And I literally mean everything in your game. What you would do, for example, is either you can play an animation, or if you can't do an animation or it takes too much time, you want to tween it in so that the item doesn't immediately appear, but it kind of like floats towards you. There's a little bit of an ease in and ease out instead of just a linear like acceleration curve. Those are things that, there's no clear book or like checklist that you can follow that explains all of these things. But the best way that I found to do this is by just looking at the game, getting a 1-minute clip, for example, of you doing something, throwing it into a video editor, and just looking at it over and over and asking yourself, what should we do more here? The video editor part is good for also immediately adding sound effects to see, hey, what would the impact be of a sound effect here? It's usually faster to just throw things together in a video editor than it is to immediately write the code and all of that to run the sound effects. That is a really good thing. And I think just rewatching it and always asking yourself, okay, now how can we take this even one more step further and all of that? Going back to UI, one thing here as well is like, if you want the easiest W possible, make it so that hovering over a button slightly increases the button size, and then like clicking it like gives it a little bounce. And this is so simple, but does so much for your game. We added it to Overtime Anomaly like a few days before launch, and like I remember William was also like, wow, that was like 10 lines of code and a bit of like clicking around, and it feels so much nicer and so much smoother now to navigate the UI. And that brings me to the last one that I see a lot, and this is kind of a hard one to say, but that is that sometimes if something isn't good enough, you just have to get rid of it. Maybe you have a game and you want to have voice acting in the game, but the only voice actor you could find, well, voice actor, is your cousin named Brian, who recorded some voice lines through like his $20 webcam microphone because he just is an aspiring voice actor, but isn't really treated professionally. And you're like, okay, well, it kind of sounds but I mean, it's better than nothing, right? And that's wrong. Nothing can be better than having something bad. People are much more likely to notice when something is like bad. Like for example, having that inherently ugly visual style that I talked about earlier before, or for example, very crunchy and low quality voice acting. That is going to be so much more detrimental than just getting rid of the voice acting altogether, telling your cousin Brian like, hey, you gotta improve a little bit more because this just isn't it, and then switching to just subtitles instead. I think if you wanna pull the voice acting even a bit further, you see this with like people who are like, okay, I wanna have voice acting for my game. I'm going to go to 11 Labs and get the most like emotionless, toneless voice that I can get. And then suddenly they're going to have this heartfelt speech about how their father died and whatever. And it's like, no, this is just bad once again. And I think you just need to be more critical of yourself because you're making a premium product, that the components of your game, the voice acting, the level design, whatever, it should be premium. If you have like a level and it's like, yeah, I just threw it in, but I don't think it's actually good. I think the flow is kind of weird. Either see if you can fix it or just get rid of it if you don't see an immediate solution. We had this with Forge Industry where someone also told us like, hey, you should add multiplayer. And then we started developing on a multiplayer mode and we spent, I would say like 3-4 months on it, only to then realize that, look, this is just bad. It's breaking a bunch of other stuff. Yeah, there's going to be like a few people who are disappointed now because we don't have multiplayer, but it would make the experience so much worse if we just had a crappy multiplayer, which led to more of a crappy game as well, than just getting rid of it and trying to focus instead on the things that we know that the game is good at and just keep focusing on that. So those were some things that I encountered as well from watching your guys' games, things that you're making, and just what is going on Steam in general. Let me know, did I miss something? Like what is not like it doesn't have to be a quick win, but what is something that a lot of developers often overlook when making their games that kind of just makes it that little bit better? I would love to hear from you guys. Apart from that, if you're new here, we're game developers, we make games ourselves, so we talk about the things that we learn along the way. So if you're interested in learning more about that, then be sure to head down below and subscribe because you'll be notified the moment that we release a new video. So thank you very much for watching and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!